Welcome to Secure Management Faculties. Before your mind is key, before you unlock what is seen, Secure Agent Dreyfuse. As a usual standard for this channel in present time, go down below, click the Sell Your Guns tab, go to the guns.com website. If you have any extra firearms that you do not want and you want to dispose of, follow the prompts, fill out the paperwork, and get that extra currency. Today we'll be talking about a small situation which is more triggering in nature, and it'll be called emergency defense situation. Now, I'm going to go over the situation that was just mostly triggering and provocative to me, with no bad ending result, but a predetermined, or let's say a present time of being, as I said, triggered to a performance of action of signified steps, not in no specific order, because this is real life here. And as we go over those situations, or as we go rather into the particulars of how I responded to the situation, we'll be covering four principles to reinforce the learning lesson of emergency defense situation and how you can set up and be ready for them, especially in your own home. So, for instance, we'll just call it a bedside gun story. So at the time, I was keeping my firearm stored in a cavity in front of my bed where the headboard location would be. The cavity was about the size of your palm, but still enough for your whole entire arm to get through as far as the elongation and the structure of it. And right on a level panel, there was pretty much the firearm. Now, the firearm was obviously only a place that I knew it would be. And at the time, I had guests over. And so specifically, one of the guests woke me up, and that guest said, hey, basically, in a nutshell, somebody's trying to break in. So regardless if it was a joke or not, the point is I got the cue that it's time to start moving. Now, with that said, consistently in the city that I live in, a break-in is not something that is a surprise, and it's very possible. So with that said, I immediately grabbed my gun out of the cavity, and as I grabbed my gun out of the cavity, unsheathed the holster, tossed the holster to the ground, and then started heading towards the front door location, because that's where the supposed break-in process was being done. Now, to the guest's surprise, the guest was not aware at the time that I had the firearm in the cavity. And take in mind, the firearm, like I said, or should I say, the actual size of the cavity is about the circumference of your hand and the size of your hand, and the rest of your arm can extend inside that cavity. Now, with that said, the gun was also prospectively placed there because of its size being able to fit into that cavity. Now we're talking about strategic placement here. So the guest was surprised that I even had that firearm stored there in that location. And as a note to boot, regardless if you trust the guest or not, if they see your storage placement to where you're placing your firearms, it's time to change that storage location, regardless if you trust them or not. Because if they're not a part of your emergency procedure plan, if you will, you don't want to make the assumption that they're always going to be their best self when they are around you, not in terms to hurt you, but in terms to hurt others or to hurt themselves. So proceeding and doing my inspection, there was nothing to even recall, report, or even discuss as far as the so-called conflict that may have been taking place. At the end of the process, everything was clear. Reset the alarm, make sure the door was extra locked, stayed up for a while just because I might have some post activity after the situation, and here we are at the end of the bedside gun story. Now, Let's get into those lessons talking about emergency defense situations and the principles that you can use to reinforce your emergency plan, or at least your basic strategic movement in a place that you know of, that you can construct a good line of defense and relationship between yourself, your actions, and your environment. So the first thing we'll be talking about in principle is individual training. Individual training simply has to be your training procedures in place of acknowledging the capacity of your environment and yourself. That's simply the transition of movement during evacuation or engaging procedures to the point where you understand your household and its blueprint and the capacity of movement while moving under the influence in a chaotic state to defend your place. With that said, as you're there in that state, you want to become very close and intimate with the actual blueprint structure of your household, not just because you're used to it by habit, but literally under the influence while moving in that present state and actively making rudimentary movements, if you will, to specific locations, no different than a specific drill like the old school fire drill. Something similar to the fact of moving towards a location or running towards a cellar when there's a tornado outside. You know certain habits instinctively to bunker in place and go to certain locations based off of the type of emergency. And that's the type of individual training you need to make sure you become aware of to place yourself under. Now we'll get to making that more dynamic and loosely shortly. 2, we're going to be talking about group training. This is more geared towards your family. If you have family or partnerships within that household or structure, or wherever you're at, build up a training relationship with that group in the same way that you built up with yourself after you do it individually. It doesn't have to be a firearm relation training. It can be simply, if a fire starts, exit out the front door. If a fire starts, exit out the back door. If there's a tornado, where do you go? In the basement. Shut the cellar door. It's stainless steel. Bunker in place to the right-hand corner. These are rudimentary, constant, redundant procedures that are set in place due to pre-analysis of your information of why those locations are the most optimal safe point to be in those specific locations. And after you run it to your individual self, you run it and acclimate it toward the individuals that are in your relationship, that are surrounded by you and surrounded with you. 3, we'll be talking about, again, the actual routine. Like I said, this is the actual reality of the rehearsal of it. So simply be as stringent and as rudimentary and as repetitive as possible during these phases. Do not break away from the position of obtaining the actual training routine. The famous training routine that we hear about mostly everyone's heard about, when you catch on fire, they say stop, drop, and roll. Now, of course, every situation is not really a stop, drop, and roll dynamic. But this routine has been reviewed to be the most effective to cover the whole entire body structure in its format and smothering the flame consistently, or at least presumptuously observe that that is the case. Now we're going to be talking about adaptive routine. This is 4. Adaptive routine is the point where you're dynamically adjusted. We have the training apparatuses and the training responses in place. Example, like said before, stop, drop, and roll. We know that's ingrained. We know the position of how to do it, and we know what to commit to routinely. Now it's time to add real life in the equation. Example said, stop, drop, and roll for the capacity of referring to being on fire, how do you implement stop, drop, and roll in a real life scenario? What if you're in a small cavity space? What if you don't have no room to actually drop? What if you can't stop? This comes to the point of being instinctuous with your training. After you have your training in place for the actual implement of its consistent rudimentary form, it's time to apply that training to the apparatus of real life. It's not just simply stop, drop, and roll. It's not just simply place your firearm, then run to the front door location, check the window, and run back to the front door. It's about what's really actually going on to implement a warrant, your training to be modified on spot at their location, to modify it based off of the situation. Are you being able to do the procedures that are set in place, or not being able to do the procedures set in place? And simply put, adaptive routines is instinctively going back to a routine that you constructed knowledgeably and in a specific framework that usually can't be broken. All right, secure management faculties. When your mind is key before you unlock what is seen. Secure Agent Dreyfus. Once again, click below. If you want to make some extra currency, hit the Sell Your Guns link. Follow the link, fill out the paperwork, send your gun out, make some extra currency. The website is guns.com. Hit the direct link to go to the page straight off so you won't have to search for it. Appreciate all who have observed this content. And if you will or choose to dim so for yourself, give me some feedback down in the comments. Much appreciated for the observation. Until the next upload.